Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Ciao, Marina.
Ciao.
Hello, Marina, parti direttamente tu?
How we start?
Parte Lorenzo.
Parte Lorenzo.
Sì, introduce lui. No, introduce lui.
I'm talking. Can you hear me?
Okay.
No,
So,
you can't.
va bene,
you
va
can.
bene.
Ah, that's great. Okay. So I will wait 3 more minutes and then start.
Lorenzo, avvio la registrazione, ok?
Ok, grazie. Okay, shall we start? Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice lunch break. We will now start speaking about about health, human health. This will be the second part of the day, and we will be back to an overall overview at 4:15 when we will have the same invited presentation. So now in the next hour, we will focus on human health. We will have 3 of us speaking. It will be me, Marina Boido, Dennis Arigiannis. And as usual, we will talk about 50 minutes each, and then we will have time for questions. You can put questions in the chat as you have done until now. And then we will answer at the end of answer questions at the end of each presentations. So I think we can start right away. I ask Marina and Dennis and me to stay in the 15 minutes with the presentation. And Marina, please, the floor is yours. You can start.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, I share my screen so I can really start. First of all, I would like just to say a few words about me. Introduce myself as something that's been said this morning, but I'm Marina Boido. I'm an associate professor in human anatomy at the University of Turin, and I carry out my research here in this institute, the Neuroscience Institute Cavalieri Ottolenghi, NICO. that is a quite young institute completely dedicated to the neuroscience and so to the study of the nervous system function. So in particular, I studied the central nervous system that consists of the brain that is protected by the skull and on the spinal cord that is protected by the vertebral column. And the level of the central nervous system, the CNS, you can find, of course, the neurons, so the cells that generate and transmit the nerve impulses, and also other kind of cells that we can call glial cells, without entering into the details, that are a cell that support the neurons. They have many functions indeed, but we can just say that they help a neuron in their correct function. And in particular, I studied not all, but some neurodegenerative disease. These kind of diseases are chronic and disabling diseases that can affect both young and old people. And depending on the disease, the symptoms may include motor or sensory dysfunction, impaired speech, or a problem in swallowing, lack of balance, cognitive impairment, pain, etc. And with the very few exceptions, if the neurons are affected by this kind of disease, they are lost, they die, and cannot be replaced. So first of all, how can we study the nervous system? Okay, so we can use some very simple model that is represented by the cell cultures. So in vitro models, you can put the cells of interest, the neurons, the glial cells, in a petri dish as this one, and you can start to study them to evaluate some in a preliminary way, some mechanism that can be altered or something like that, or you can also test some treatments. Or you can study by electrophysiological approaches the functioning of this neuron, for example. But then, as I told you, it's a very, of course, simple model. So you should use also probably a more complex model that are represented from in vivo models, as for example the rodent models, mice and rats. There are a number of genetically modified mice, for example, that can mimic the neurodegenerative disease of interest, and you can then follow by behavioral tests to evaluate their performance, to evaluate the onset, the progression of the disease, and also, if possible, if you can do some treatment, you can evaluate the efficacy of this treatment. And then, of course, you can also study the brain of the spinal cord by doing sections. So histological section, you can evaluate by staining, you can evaluate the expression of some particular proteins, enzymes, or what you want by different techniques. And also you can study, if you are able, so the single organelles of these neurons. For example, here you can see a very nice mitochondria that is possible to see by electron microscopy. Okay, so coming back to the topic of today, so the question is, can global and climate change influence our central nervous system health? The answer is probably yes. We will see why I suggest this answer. And to start, we have to mention the environment. The environment where we live and that surrounds us, because starting from prenatal life, our organism is continuously exposed to different types of stress, which shape it and promote its maturation, so also in a beneficial way, let's say, but can also determine the accumulation of alteration that predispose to the pathology. So what can we consider as a stressor? The term stressor indicates any kind of perturbations in a system or environment that affect the organism's optimal functioning. And here just some example of stressors. We can talk about the pollutants, so the pollution that surround us, or of course the environmental and global changes, or also, for example, increasing population density. Everything is related to the concept of exposome, and the exposome represents the totality of environmental exposures that an individual experiences during his or her life. And this concept, you will see, will be further discussed also by my colleagues. And so stressful lifestyle, the increase in temperature, also the warming, and many other exogenous factors can early lead to cellular and molecular permanent also changes in neurons, which are currently only partially known. So I will try now to give you some example of the effect of different stress on our brain. Starting from the warming, so the increasing of the temperature can be related to the climate change that we are experiencing. So there are not so many studies. Some of them are in vitro, other in vivo, in different kind of model, using different kind of models from mice. There is also some very few studies on humans. And I try to summarize here the main results, so the main evidence that arising from the studies. So, for example, some authors observed that the warming can induce stress conditions in the cells, I'm talking about the neurons, and can, for example, alter the gene expression, so damage the DNA of the neurons, affecting the neuronal structure and also the brain organization, impairing, for example, the functional connectivity, so the network of the neurons and also the connectivity between different brain areas. The increasing temperature can also influence the metabolism, the basal metabolic rate of the cells. And then it's been also observed in different studies that the warming can induce a kind of special inflammation that is typical of the brain, that is called neuroinflammation, and that in this special kind of inflammation related to the nervous system involve both the glial cells, but also the immune system. And these cells can release, for example, pro-inflammatory molecules that in some way affect the state of the neurons, and, for example, can induce a neurodegeneration, so can induce the cell death. Moreover, also the oxidative stress, so the production of free radicals, can be triggered by the warming, and again, in turn, induce neurodegeneration. So here, I don't want to go into the details because, of course, I can understand that the figure can be complex for many of you, of course, but I would like to say very few words just to try to highlight that the warming, this is an hypothetical, these are hypothetical mechanisms that have been suggested, but the idea is that warming, the heat exposure can affect different molecular cascade pathways into the cells, into the neurons. And for example, as I told you, induce the oxidative stress that lead to neurodegeneration, or also acting, for example, on mitochondria. They are the key organelles in the cells that produce the energy for the cells, and then they can be affected by this prolonged exposure, heat exposure, and leading to apoptosis. This is a kind of cell death, so again to neurodegeneration. Can also affect the exchange of ions, very important for the neurons, and again leading to neurodegeneration. So here there is an example. For example, I think that all of you know the Alzheimer's disease, that is a kind of dementia that affects the old people generally, and it's characterized by the accumulation, the aggregation of this amyloid plaque that alter the functioning of the neurons. And it's been seen that hyperthermia, for example, could result in Alzheimer's disease-like molecular phenotype, so including this formation of amyloid plaques. But also slight changes in the temperature can considerably change the folding and the aggregation of this protein. On the other side, it was found that dementia-suffering people, for example, suffering Alzheimer, have considerable circadian dysfunction in the body temperature control, and thus has been proposed that these people would be more affected by the global warming phenomenon. And here, just some other example of studies here, looking at the increased oxidative stress at the level of the hippocampus, that is a structure of the brain that is responsible for the memory and is affected in Alzheimer's disease patients. And you can see that it's increased the oxidative stress markers, but also here the amyloid beta fibrillation that is triggered by the increased temperature. Then just to mention other kind of stress, I would like to just say a few words on pollution. And this morning we talked also about other kind of pollution. Now I would like to mention the air pollution, that is a cocktail of suspending gases, solids, and liquid particles that in this mix, in particular, the component that appear most dangerous for the brain is the particulate matter, PM. And these tiny particles can reach the brain passing through the olfactory nerve, so by the nose. And the interesting thing is that they do not travel alone, but they carry on their surface some contaminants, also ions, that can accumulate, for example, into the brain. This has been observed in some studies, also performed during the gestational period. So after 14 days of exposure to pollutants into the brain has been observed trace of silica, of iron, of aluminium, for example, and also damage at the level of the axon of the neurons, and of course again has been observed an alteration of the inflammation. So again, the neuroinflammation can occur also after the contact, let's say, with these pollutants, leading again to neurodegeneration. And then finally, there is also another kind of stress, that is the social stress. We live in a crazy society, and we experience every day, let's say, a stressful lifestyle. And so we can talk about stress-related disorders that involve the anxiety, the depression, memory deficit, for example, and specifically in the central nervous system. Again, you can see that also this kind of stress can induce similar alteration at the level of the cells. So again, the reactive oxygen species, so oxidative stress increasing, again, neuroinflammation, alteration of the cells and of the activity, and again, epigenetic, so mutation that involve again the DNA and neurodegeneration. So just to conclude, the idea of the project, in particular, to study the effect of this stressor, environmental and social stressor, in neurodegenerative disease, in particular we will focus on motor neuron disease, on ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, that is a dramatic, terrible disease that affects the motor neurons, that are neurons responsible for the movements, let's say, for they innervate the skeletal muscle, that are the muscle that we voluntarily move. And in this pathology, these neurons are selectively affected, they die, and also the muscle that they innervate become atrophied. We would like to study, as I was telling, the effect of this stressor on the onset and progression of this disease in experimental models, in order to shed light on the stressor impact on the nervous system, central nervous system, and on the predisposition to neurological pathologies. And I have done, so I hope to stay in time, and I stop here the sharing.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, I will go.
One is about the definition of warming in the context, but you might maybe answer directly on the chat on that. Then there is another one on the eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, whether this would be a form of social stress-related disorder or stressor.
Yes, okay. For considering the definition of warming, probably I try to put everything together, because of course there are different concepts in the term of warming. I summarize here different studies, some are related to prolonged warming, other to acute heat exposure. Also the term hyperthermia maybe can be discussed in deeper detail. And of course, we have to think also to other kind of situation in which we will, which we should experience. So the heat waves that our body in the future would experience, and these experiences. So probably I was mentioning, I will try to summarize in the term, different kind of experiments that have been performed, and some of them, for example, on humans, I remember, was exposure to an increased temperature range of between 45 to 50 degrees, let's say. With also the term social stress-related disorder, I was in particular thinking to other kind of, not other, but general kind of social stress that affects our life commonly. And I think that also the eco-anxiety should be included in this sense. But of course, we are, these are speculation, at least because we have not so many studies at the moment. Some of them suggest that, as I try to show, different mechanisms into the cells, into the neurons, are similarly affected. So probably I try to broaden the concept, but just to give the idea that in different way, different stressors can affect in similar way, and similar mechanism, and some of these mechanisms altered by the stress are already altered in this kind of neurodegenerative disease. So the idea is that living in a context, in an environment characterized by all this stressor can, in this way, anticipate maybe the onset and the progression of these diseases that already are predisposed, in these people that are predisposed maybe to this kind of pathologies.
Okay, thank you. We can move on to the next presentation. If there are more questions in the chat, you can answer them in the chat, and maybe if we have time in the end, we can bring some of them back for discussion. I will share the screen now. Okay. So I will give the next presentation. This presentation, as Marina mentioned, the concept of the exposome will come back probably in all the presentations. So it's a kind of fil rouge among the three presentations. I will then focus on birth cohorts. This is my email, and my affiliation is the University of Turin. I would like to start with the concept of planetary health, just to mention it. Planetary health is a new concept that has been introduced a few years ago, which try to emphasize the fact that there is a clear link between the health of the humans and the health of the social and natural systems in which we live as humans. So the idea is to emphasize that there is a circular connection between our health and how we live as humans and the health of the planet. And you can find a reference in this slide, and also a more detailed description. And maybe Dennis will bring this concept back in his presentation. Planetary health seen with the angle of the human, so with a maybe narrow focus, so focusing now on human health, can be depicted in this picture, in which you have the human, all the different factors, several factors that can affect the human health. So you have the urban environment, some of the factors that have been discussed even this morning, the health of the oceans and the health of the water, and also the social and so economical and social factor, migration. All these factors can affect altogether in synergy the human health. And this is kind of a complex scenario we have to face when studying human health and trying to improve it. And this kind of net of exposures we are exposed to has been named the exposome, as Marina was already saying. And this concept has been introduced in 2005 by Chris Wilde, who was at that time the director of the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and was defined as the life course environmental exposures from prenatal period onwards, even to death, if you want to consider the whole period of life. And at that time, the idea of the exposome was put forward because we were in a situation, we maybe still are in a situation, in which the genome was very carefully studied. So we could measure it and assess the genetic variability quite thoroughly, while when it comes to the exposure, environmental exposure, then it is much more difficult. And Chris Wilde used this example of this crow here, which has a very developed claw, which might be our ability to study the genetics, while the right claw is a bit atrophic, is very small, and this was at that time, and probably it is still the case, even if things have been improved over time, our ability to study the environmental exposures. So a big difference. And then Chris Wilde was saying, well, we should focus on also on the life course environmental exposure, which was named the exposomes. The exposome includes several domains, which are summarized here. So we have some specific lifestyles, external environment, like tobacco smoking, like diet, like physical activity, the usual lifestyles that strongly affect our life. But we also have the external environment, which is more in focus on this in this PhD program, like the climate, like the urban environment, the social capital, etc. And then we can also measure the internal changes, molecular changes in the using the different omics techniques. And all these aspects will affect the human health at the end, as you can see here on the right side of the slide. It is not easy to measure the exposome. First of all, because we have to measure it repeatedly over time. As you can see with the red arrows here, it changes, it dynamically changes the exposome over time. So we have to measure it repeatedly. And also we have to use several different approaches to measure the exposome using, for example, biomarkers or sensor technology, imaging, different devices, modeling based on geocoding, etc. So everything we can use to assess the exposome, it would be useful, and we should do it this several times over time, several times over the life course. So it's rather difficult. At the end, we will have a kind of exposure network. At the left part of the slide, there are basically different levels of the exposure. Some of them are more distant from us, like the climate, the kind of stressors that Marina was mentioning, the economics part, and then we have something closer to the body, to the person, up to the actual response that can be biological response that can be assessed within the person. But all these kind of exposures are correlated. And this on the right side, you can see an analysis that was done on 6 cohorts around Europe, in which they measured the correlation of the exposures within families of exposures, as also between families of exposure. For example, as you can see here, the lines represent correlation. Each circle is an exposure, and the colors represent the different families. There is definitely correlation within families, like the built environment, the traffic, indoor air pollution, etc. But there are also lines between different families. So at the end, we are exposed to a correlated to a cluster of exposures that each of them act in combination with the others. And this is why it's very difficult to reconstruct the net of the exposure. This is another similar example. It's a correlation matrix that we, based on data from the city of Turin, of some of our studies. And here we have lifestyle, diet, metaclimatic variables, traffic, and building environment. And then we have a correlation, which when the color is very strong, it means that there is a strong correlation. When the red color means a positive correlation, and blue color means a negative correlation. And as you can see, there are strong colors here and there in this correlation matrix, both within the same families and among the different families. And this happens when you look at the exposure at a single point in time, so cross-sectionally. The things are even more complicated when we try to look at with a cohort perspective. So depending on when we are born, then we will be, during our life course, we'll be exposed to different level of exposures, which is a kind of, you can see in this slide, a kind of simple study, but very interesting, which trying to estimate the lifetime heat wave exposure depending on the year of birth and depending on different scenarios of increasing temperature in the world. And as you can see here from the central, the graph in the middle, those born in 1960s are expected to be exposed to a number of lifetime heat waves, which is much smaller to those born in 2020. And this is because the exposures accumulate over time. So if in general the heat waves are more frequent, when during the life course you will have many more situations in which you are exposed to heat waves if you are born in 2020 than if you are born in 1960. And this on the right side, you can see the same analysis based on your birth. So you can find your excess exposure compared to those born in 1960s. And of course, this brings the concept of the intergenerational inequalities, which is also mentioned in the title of the reference that you can find at the bottom of the slide. The cohort perspective is important for what regards the exposure, but it's now very clear that it's also important for what regards health. Now health is seen as a life course model in which you start being exposed at the beginning of your life, and then you have high health trajectories. And the health trajectories can be shaped over time through prevention activities. But on the other hand, if you start at high risk with a high risk trajectory, you will bring this risk with you during your life course. So also the health shouldn't be measured at a given point in time, like for example at old ages, but it should be seen as a trajectory. We now have a situation in which the exposure levels depend on time, place, age, and several other factors. And also they should be assessed throughout life, and as well also the health status should be assessed as a trajectory during the life course. This is an example of how the exposure levels may depend on just on the place where you live, as we all know, but this is an empirical example of a study that we have done in different cities in Italy. And this is on the left side, you have exposure to PM10. On the right side, you have exposure to PM2.5. Each vertical line is a child participating in this study. And as you can see, in people born in Florence, several different centers of the study had a quite low exposure, likely to PM10 and PM2.5, but there was one center, which is the city of Turin, in which the exposure was very high. And for part of the year, the children were exposed to a concentration which was about the current or actually past WHO daily limit values. So, apart from time, place, and age, it is also the socio-economic position, which is a strong driver of the exposome. Again, here you can see some of our data. On the left side, you have the city of Turin with different areas colored with in red if they have a low deprivation index, if they are the most deprived actually, and in blue color if they are the least deprived, and the dots are the children participating to a study. And as you can see, we have children coming from different areas of the city with different levels of deprivation. And the deprivation itself, which is depicted on the right side of the slide, is a strong determinant of the exposome. You will have different levels of exposure depending on the different socioeconomic status of the people. So at the end, the life course, to try to study this complex link between the exposome and the health trajectories, we try to use approaches which are named life course epidemiology, in which we measure the exposome many times, we measure the health status many times, And we try to then link these two aspects together. In the type of studies that are used to do this kind of find the link between the exposome and the health. It's not the only possibility, but is a strong tool or study setting in which to study this association are the birth course studies, which are characterized by the fact that we measure the exposures and the outcomes prospectively. We have long-term follow-up. Participants are recruited at birth or during fetal life and then followed up throughout life. We repeatedly measure the exposure and the outcome, and then we have biological samples to try to identify molecular markers of exposure and effect. So this is the approach that we can use to try to put together to study the association between the exposome and the health outcomes. There are many European cohorts of this type, many birth cohorts of this time, for example, around Europe, and they are, there is a network of this kind of studies, and it's possible to access the data, to ask for, to run studies using these data. This is just a picture taken from the Life Cycle project. We put together the different birth cohorts around Europe, so it's a great resource for studying the effects of the exposome. This is an example of a study in Italy, which is the NYMPHEA cohort, which enrolled participants between 2005 and 2016 and is following up these children. And as you can see, they were enrolled during pregnancy, and then there are questionnaires 6 months, 18 months, and then 4, 7, 10, 13, and 16 years. So you continually collect information and you model the exposures and trying then to do studies to put together, to link those exposures with the health trajectories. And if you are interested in this kind of studies, there is also a video that we created in order to describe what is the rationale and how these studies are conducted and what information you can get from this kind of studies. And you can find the link to the video in the bottom of this slide. So just to conclude, I want to mention how this, the exposome, how to bring back the concept of the exposome and this kind of studies to the concept of planetary health. And there are different ways to do this, and I know that the idea of co-benefits has been already mentioned in the past week in other curricula of this project. And this is just an example of this program. So this is just an example of how you can measure for example, the dietary contribution to greenhouse gas emission and land use associated with different types of diets, and then associated with this with mortality. So you can try to identify how different diets are associated with different levels of emissions, and at the same time may be also risk factor for mortality, associated with different levels of mortality. So I think I can end here, and so I will stop my presentation. Not sure if I can do that. Okay, I managed to do that. And I'm not sure whether there are any questions, or maybe we can.
There is one question for you from Sara Bianchi. The question is if there are case studies that link exposure levels to urban planning. So essentially, if we can use the exposure levels for making cities more livable.
Oh yes, definitely. There is a lot of this can go under the name of kind of urban health or urban planning linked to health. So there are ways to make our cities more friendly to the people living in the cities, but also more healthy. And there is a lot really a lot going on this issue. There are like green spaces, the organization even of the shops, walkability is another factor that can be linked to health. The air pollution, so the measures to mitigate air pollutions can also have co-benefits for health, not only through the decreased air pollution, but also, for example, through active transportation, which again is linked to the urban planning, because we should make active transportation possible in order to people to do that. So definitely there is a strong link between urban planning and human health, and there are projects we're also involved in some of these projects, which see the collaboration of engineering and medicine in order to identify the best way to act on the city and on the urban planning, and at the same time have positive effects on human health. Okay, so if there will be more questions, I can answer in the chat, but now I would like to leave the floor to Dennis, who will conclude the section on human health. So Dennis, if you want to start.
Thank you so much indeed. Actually, let me start from where you left it, because indeed the urban health issue is a very important one, especially in Europe, given the very high number of more dense areas in Europe. So most of the 550 million people of Europeans actually live in cities. So urban health is a very important issue. There's an important cluster of European projects called Urban Health Cluster indeed. And in EU we are running one of these projects called Urbanome, which is about the urban exposome. So indeed, there's a lot of work that's being done on different areas, including nature-based solutions, including green and blue space proximity and sort of identification, how we can actually improve the way we live within the cities. And it is in this concept and in this context that the climate exposome concept is being coined, is being put together. And let's try to see what this is about. So these are the major climate health challenges related to climate change. Marina and Lorenzo have already referred to them to a certain extent. You see the climate drivers, indeed, increased temperatures, but also not just temperature, also precipitation extremes, extreme weather events, even sea level rise is actually can modulate exposure to a number of stressors, to health stressors, including extreme heat, poor air quality, as Marina mentioned, but also reduced food and water quality. And here you can see very immediately the link with the previous session on water and ecosystem, water system health, if you like. Changes in infectious agents. Well, I think the current situation with the pandemic testifies to that. And also, of course, population displacement, movements, migratory movements of population because of extreme environmental conditions that, for instance, can bring in famine, can bring wars because of water scarcity and other resource scarcity, and thus induce displacement of people, which also means that the displacements reduce their quality of life. This can have different types of health outcomes, including heat-related illness, as Marina very nicely described, and also from the point of view of mechanisms, but also cardiopulmonary illnesses, food, water, and vector-borne disease, and of course, mental health consequences and stress. And that's a very important issue right now in Europe. Now, all of these are, of course, also modulated by two different sets of frameworks. One is the environmental and institutional context, including land use and ecosystem change, as you heard it this morning, infrastructure condition, geography, agricultural production, livestock use, but also social and behavioral issues, including age and gender of the population. Usually, we say that in Europe, we tend to ageify. I mean, our population to make the European population becomes more, older, and compared to other areas in the world, race and ethnicity, and of course also genetic predisposition can play a role, but also cultural issues that are related to race and ethnicity can modulate the exposures. Poverty, housing, and infrastructure are, of course, important issues, which are also related to things like population displacement, for instance. If you think about the immigrant state of living even in Europe right now, obviously there are issues related to poverty, to bad housing conditions, and also to infrastructure, to lack of good enough infrastructure. Education, as I said before, cultural issues play a very important role to actual exposure. And I think Lorenzo actually mentioned the social and socioeconomic dimension of the exposome. Well, here education is even more important, is among the most important aspects of the socioeconomic dimension, not just money, but also, how well you make decisions on the basis of how well you understand the information you obtain, and that is part of having a better education. But also discriminatory issues and, of course, access to care and community health infrastructure can be very important obstacles to good health. Now, at the same time, you have a number of vulnerabilities related to population stark groups affected by climate change. There are particular sensitive groups of the population because of their their age and in the life course, children, neonates, and also children during development, the elderly, of course, but also women in fertility age, pregnant women in particular, and of course people with chronic illnesses or with immunosuppressive condition. Socially and economically distinct groups of the population, like outdoor workers, like people living in cities, and especially the more, the less well-off parts of the cities, or even in remote regions, and of course low-income people are usually considered as more vulnerable to the kind of climate change-induced stress. And there's, of course, also regionally distinct groups of the population, including, indeed, and now I'm smiling because I saw some questions in the chat on inhabitants of tropics and subtropics, but also small islands, mountainous and Arctic regions, which are considered, again, as being more vulnerable vis-a-vis their health with regard to the potential conditions affected by climate change. Now, what are the links? So, as I said, there's a number of exposure links, of course, between climate change and health. There's a number of pathways and connecting the exposure to health outcomes, including transmission dynamics of both chemicals and biological stressors, agroecosystem health and hydrology. And here again, you see the very close link with ecosystem health in this curriculum. And of course, socioeconomics and demographics, which are very important modulating factors for having actual health effects, including, again, temperature-related illness and death, extreme weather, air pollution, water and foodborne disease, vector-borne and even rodent-borne disease, effect of food and water shortage, and effect of population displacement. I just want to go through very fast the actual risk modulators. Here, there are factors like extreme heat and that increase, and factors that modulate this linkage with ill health is, of course, issues like living in a home with poor insulation or no air conditioning, working outdoors for extended periods of time, not having access to emergency healthcare, not having access to emergency public health warnings in native language. And here you see how different dimensions of what is, if you like, the social, in this case, exposome, actually can play a role in how heat even affects human health, besides the mechanistic side that Marina very nicely described. Poor air quality. Again, obviously, there's very important links with ill health, and there's a number of factors that increase the risk, like living in an urban area, especially one that has a lot of air pollution, even though great food, talking about Torino, working outdoors, and also having medical problems like hypertension, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders, or asthma, so respiratory problems. But also not having access to public health information in native language. And here again, you see there's not just the physiological modulators, but also cultural modulators. Extreme events and how they affect health. There's a number of factors that increase risk, including having limited transportation options, limited access to healthcare services or medication needed for medical problems, having no or limited even health insurance or property insurance, and not having access to public health warnings in native language, and of course contaminated water, related illnesses. Modulators here include living in an area with treated drinking water systems that are old or below standards, and that is not something that does not happen in Europe, even though we are in an advanced part of the world vis-a-vis these kind of issues. Still, there's a number of areas with water quality problems, even in Italy. Living in an area with untreated water, such as well water, that is again a classic one in Hungary right now. That is a very important issue. Living in a crowded shelter after evacuations for an extreme event, and you see here how the link between natural events like floodings or wildfires, things that are traditionally linked to climate change, are actually can have indirect effects on water-related illnesses. And of course, the question of the cultural barriers in terms of language in this case. But there's also issues like access to safe and nutritious food, which of course can play a role in health, and modulators here, including not having access to information on how to handle safely the food, living in areas with limited access to high quality food choices, having existing or chronic medical problems, and actually again, not having enough information, public health information that can be understood. These aspects, the food link, if you like, is not just related to socioeconomic condition. It is also a question of living in big cities, not having enough linkage with where food is being produced, and so on and so forth. And of course, the key question of mental health and well-being, which now attracts much more attention by everybody in Europe. Here again, not having access to mental health care, and having an existing mental illness can be a modulator, especially if people need to take stress medication. That increases sensitivity to heat, as Marina mentioned. You see how there is clear linkage here. Living in an area that is vulnerable to extreme weather events, and having limited social support networks, which again can be a factor that is related to, if you like, the social exposome of the population. Heart disease, diabetes, asthma, COPD can be health-related conditions that actually can increase sensitivity to heat stress, or even to other types of climate change-related health stressors. Now, what do we do this? What do we do? What do we do right now is to actually, if you think about it in a historic of climate change action, we're talking about the era of committed climate change. So you see here the task, the commitment of the 1.5 degree goal of Paris. So this is the situation of the committed climate change of 1.5 degrees. And we're trying to actually keep it at that level. But then by the end of the century, which actually, you think about it, is the time of the exposome, because if you recall what Lorenzo mentioned, he talked about the exposome being the integration, the integral of exposures over the life course. Well, if the life course is about 80 years for a child that is born in 2020, 2880 to 2100, is actually the era of the exposome, of his or her individual exposome. And indeed, it is the time when climate options will actually have run out. So we would need to be able to adapt to a number of aspects here, as you see, that are related to health. So the question is how to actually do that in the best way. And here, what we're trying to do in this research activity in news, and also in the international networks that relate to the climate exposome, is that to actually address the interactions between activity sectors and changing environment, to understand the links between exposure and effects of a number of chemical stressors, physical stressors, and biological stressors, and also try to see the interactions between these types of stressors and how they interplay with the vulnerabilities and socioeconomic factors that, in the end of the day, modulate the vulnerability of the population to climate change. So this is how we sort of have designed the approach to the climate exposome. It's a complex picture, trying to essentially pull together more or less all the information that the colleagues Marina and Lorenzo highlighted before. So if you follow this, you start from the different areas of human activity, moving to a number of modeling and data fusion activities that actually pull together the data that is now very abundantly becoming available, but which require a very good possibilities to decipher them, to understand how exactly you need to interpret, to actually take into account to some extent both the stochasticity of socioeconomic of behavioral change, like using, for instance, advanced artificial intelligence techniques like agent-based modeling, advanced sensing and ubiquitous sensing, even wearable sensors, to try to connect and eventually recreate, if you like, reproduce the exposome, the external exposome, and then in the end, and then try to use biomonitoring data, so actually analysis of human samples, blood or urine or other biological fluids, to actually run a number of omics analysis, transcriptomics, so gene expression data, metabolomics, metabolome, metabolic profiling, change, epigenetic analysis that demonstrate how the actually interaction of the genome with the exposome can modulate how the genome itself is being expressed. And eventually using a system biology approach and advanced bioinformatics to try to derive the adverse outcome pathways that link eventually the exposome to system level effects, so health effects on the individual basis, and then using exposome-wide association studies, try to draw this to the community level. So indeed, then be able to translate to community population level health impact. And that the reason for needing to do that, even though that's a very complex step, is because you really want to seek solutions to this problem, not just analyze them. And indeed, the idea here is to embrace the complexity of this approach so as not to miss out on critical information, but in the end of the day, seek the simplest possible solutions to the problems. So just by way of example, and I'm closing more or less with that, is try to understand common disease pathways. I think what Marina mentioned earlier, that there's a number of stressors which may have common pathways and mechanisms of action, is a very important realization. So here you see a number, as I said before, a number of environmental factors that are affected by climate change, including diet, chemicals, heat stress, UV radiation, infection, social conditions, and stress. This can, as Marina mentioned, induce, on the basis, of course, of understanding genetic vulnerabilities, inflammation and oxidative stress, which has been linked with both neurodegenerative disease, both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, with a number of mechanisms, as mentioned before, but also disrupted insulin signaling, which can bring about obesity and diabetes, type 2, but also respiratory problems like asthma, for instance. And again, here you see how there's a number of interlinkages of three very important different, if you like, areas of health outcomes, but which can be related to similar stressors through, let's say, adjacent or adjunct mechanisms. And I think that's a very important avenue for research. The idea, in the end of the day, is to use all this information not just to understand, but actually to do that, to create a framework for action that can indeed address the question of climate change and health by taking into account both the question of exposures and risks, but also identify how co-benefits or adverse health consequences can actually come about, and taking into account what you might call climate behaviors, which of course bring about the social and socioeconomic dimension of the whole endeavor. In the end of the day, to try to create effective climate processes and strategies to address, in the end, the overall adverse health impact. So that is essentially the overall approach. For us, the idea is to use the climate exosome as a mechanism to serve precise and cost-effective prevention by understanding better the multifactorial cause of disease, identifying early on the biological onset of adverse health outcomes, identify the interplay among disease mechanisms in relation to both environmental stressors and climate change, and finally, produce integrated strategies for combating climate change, environmental contamination, and promoting precise prevention. Precise in the sense of not just taking into account the genetic vulnerability, but actually taking into account the modulators, the factors that I mentioned before, socioeconomics, prior health conditions, so on and so forth. Okay, that was it. I'll try to stop sharing now. And Lorenzo?
Thank you, Dennis. I don't see specific questions in the chat, and it's now 4:02. Maybe we could move it if it is okay with you, and if there are no questions from the audience not put in the chat, we could move it to the next presentation by Francesca Valetti and maybe bring some of these issues back to your discussion and conclusions at the end of the day. Would this be okay, Dennis?
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay, great. Then Francesca, I can see you if you want to start your presentation, and then you can basically handle the discussion part and then go to the next section.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm Francesca Valetti from the University of Torino.
Maybe
and I will
put it in the presentation.
Yes, sorry, I forgot. Okay, so can you see it in the presentation? It takes a while. Okay, is it okay?
Okay.
Okay. So I'm Francesca Valetti from the University of Torino. I will try and give you the perspective of a biochemist and biotechnologist on some climate change mitigation, in particular for CO2 capture, and to see how we can exploit the biochemistry and biotechnological, let's say, technologies from classical to novel approaches to decrease the CO2 percentage in the atmosphere. Of course, we can say that well, the elaboration of carbon by living organism is, of course, something which is mainly related to photosynthesis. Here is a quote of a famous chemist and writer from Torino, and he states, if the elaboration of carbon were not a common daily occurrence on the scale of billions of tons a week, wherever the green of a leaf appears, it would be by fully right deserve to be called a miracle. And in fact, if you see at the beauty of the mechanism, both of light capture and then of how this energy can be converted to the capture of CO2 and the organication of carbon, then of course is something that is fascinating, of course, more for a biochemist, but in general. So of course we can think that this is the more classical CO2 capture strategy in life. But of course there is much more. It's not only the photosynthetic organism, either cyanobacteria or algae or plants, but there is a lot of other organisms which can somehow convert CO2 into biomass. They can somehow use other kind of strategies. There are some autotrophic microorganisms which are also able to live on simple CO2 without having the need of other energy or carbon supply, just simply by oxidizing an organic substrate, maybe in condition where plants cannot live, like hydrothermal vents, which were very ancient. Probably they were the cradle of our last common ancestor. Of course, the biological carbon sequestration has also the advantage of being a process which happens at very mild condition, neutral pH, low temperature, and of course, by definition, is an eco-friendly approach. In general, the warning is that this autotrophic organism, meaning organism that can somehow, like plants or like bacteria that uses inorganic substances, be very efficient, it's not really the most efficient way. Heterotrophic microorganisms, which need also other extra carbon source, they can though implement much higher efficiency processes to trap and use CO2 and then to, let's say, mitigate the effect of CO2 in atmosphere. So if you have a look at the, let's say, the cycle, which you see on the right, of course, don't get scared about the cycle itself. It's not a point of seeing all the formulas, but you see that on the 6 identified pathway up to now, of course, just 5 are pathway of carbon capture, which occurs in bacteria. So plant, algae, and cyanobacteria, which are based, of course, on Rubisco enzyme, they are, of course, very important, but there are other enzymes and other cycles which are very important, and we can try and apply these strategies to capture CO2. In particular, we will focus on one cycle here, which is called the acetyl coenzyme A reductive cycle, or it's named Wood and Lugdal from the names of the 2 researchers who discovered it. And in particular, in this cycle, there are 2 enzymes, FDH and CODH, on which I will come back later. Okay, so this pathway is interesting because it occurs in certain bacteria, which are called acetogenic bacteria. And you can see that there are 2 strategies. CO2 can be converted by one of these enzymes, which was called FDH in the previous slide, which is in reality named formate dehydrogenase. And it can convert a CO2 into formate with the advantage of converting a gas into a liquid, which can be easily stored, which is a more reduced compound, which can then be further reduced, for instance, to formaldehyde or to methanol, which is a fuel. On the other side, we have another branch of this pathway, which then converts CO2 to carbon monoxide. And here, of course, the enzyme is very interesting too, but still a bit more difficult to apply because we convert a gas into another gas, which is also toxic. In reality, this pathway has already been applied in industrial application. You see here the scheme of this bacterial Clostridium. They can be fed with syngas, which is a gas which can be produced from waste, which contains CO, CO2, and hydrogen. And this syngas can be converted by the bacterium into acetyl coenzyme A, which is an intermediate. And then by the cellular metabolism, it can provide ethanol or 2,3-butanediol or other compounds which are relevant as fuels or as intermediate in fine chemistry. Of course, they can then be used for bioplastics, for other application in the chemical industry. Of course, this is a way of mitigating the emission of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the company which has implemented this strategy is called LanzaTech. They started in 2005 with the strain development. They have a demo, and they also have a commercial, which is not as efficient because the scaling up is not always very easy. But this is an industrial reality which has already implemented the natural propensity of microorganisms to be able to fix CO2 into useful compounds. We cannot forget, on the other side, the archaea. Archaea are not bacteria. They are another kind of living organism, and archaea are used in methane production, in methane production plants from waste, for instance. In this case, archaea are very appealing as an application, and there is already a very consolidated technology. They can use electrons coming from hydrogen and CO2 as an acceptor. Then CO2 is reduced progressively, and by this sort of redox chain, there is a energy which is formed, which is a proton motive force. What is a proton motive force? The same that is generated in our mitochondria. So in reality, it's just that the protons are accumulated outside the cell, not in the inner membrane, let's say in the intermembrane space as in mitochondria, but the principle is the same. We accumulate some ions, which then can be used as a force to drive the synthesis of ATP. Okay, so the principle is that, of course, we have a win-win strategy, because for the bacterium, for the archaea, the methane is a waste. It can use CO2 as a source of, let's say, this driving force. And for us, of course, methane is a fuel. So in reality, the CO2, let's say, consumed is about 90–95%. What is produced is not pure methane, is a mixture of methane and CO2. But of course, we can purify it. Methanogenesis is not a fermentation, it's a curious form of respiration. If you think about it, what do they breathe? They breathe something which is analogous to our oxygen, but it's not oxygen. Think about it. Maybe we can discuss it later. Okay, you just have to think about what is the final acceptor of electrons in this respiratory chain. And of course, there are a lot of examples of plants wherever in Europe and in the world. There is one quite famous close to Torino, which is producing biomethane purified, which can be then used in the normal domestic methane network. So you can use it for cooking if you're living in that area. Of course, then these are just the basics, let's say, strategies which relies on what the cell is already able to do. On the other side, we can also use synthetic biology. So we can change the cells. And for instance, there is a timeline of these synthetic biology strategies applied to, for instance, introduce some natural CO2 fixation in some microorganisms like bacteria, like Escherichia coli, for instance. Or to be able to introduce a CO2 fixation pathway, which is also combined to the ability of the organism not to need other reducing compound, or a full artificial autotrophy, which is similar to the synthesis of the capture of CO2 by photosynthetic organisms. Of course, the perspective is to improve further this possibility of organism to capture CO2 in a more efficient way and without further supply of energy. And for instance, one strategy, of course, which is typical of biotechnology, is to change and modify the genetic, let's say, setup of a cell. For instance, in E. coli is a very easy strategy. You just need to insert some plasmid, which are going to express some genes. In other cases, you can change the genetic, let's say, the genetic, let's say, organization in a more stable way. And for instance, this FDH, so this formate dehydrogenase, which is able to capture CO2 and convert it in formate, has been transformed into E. coli to make it produce a larger amount of formate. On the other side, there is a recent paper published in 2019 in Nature, which instead has engineered always an E. coli organism to be able to perform sort of an autotrophic cycle based on enzymes similar to those of photosynthesis, able to capture CO2 and to convert it into biomass at the expense of formate in this case, which is then this inorganic molecule which can supply reducing equivalent. So what is the strategy which is proposed and which we are also going to apply? Well, to try and use this enzyme, formate dehydrogenase, and the other enzyme which can further reduce CO2 to a useful fuel like methanol, in an approach which, of course, can take advantage of lowering CO2 and harvesting an important chemical molecule. Okay, the possible sources of electrons to be used for this reduction, they can come from different kind of cofactors, they can also come from current, because the enzyme typically can be interfaced directly to electrodes, in particular semiconductors. And the advantage is that enzymes usually have low overpotential, which means that the scheme of, let's say, reducing and oxidating reactions are much more similar to the blue curve here. They don't need an overpotential, so an extra energy. This is very important. And so there are several approaches. One is this one, to couple, let's say, enzyme to, let's say, photoactivated materials, which can then harvest energy directly for the photoactivated material, scavenging, unfortunately not water, which will be the ideal as it happens in photosynthesis, but other compounds, to supply directly electrons upon flashing light to the enzyme for reduction of CO2 to formate. And there are several approaches also based on more like natural light capture strategies. This is the approach of the group of Erwin Reisner in Cambridge, which exploit this possibility of capturing light and then converting the electrons, using the electrons to convert CO2 to formate. And this is also what we are going to do in this PhD project. We are aiming to use the photoactivated anode and cathode by using nanostructured materials based on metal oxides and interfacing it with enzymes like formate dehydrogenase. We have several alternatives and a new one which we isolated. And of course, with the target of a conversion of around 40% efficiency of solar to fuel to methanol. 10% is enough for commercialization, but of course, we are aiming to a more, let's say, a higher ambitious level. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to questions. I think there is a question. No? Is there any question? Too much biochemistry.
I need you to come teach in my class in Greece, Francesca. Metabolic engineering, you know.
Usually biochemistry is a bit tough to digest. So that's maybe because the reason why there are no questions.
No, it's a recall from the past. It shows why people did not choose to go into chemistry.
Well, actually, I'm a biologist, but I'm a more chemistry biased.
Excellent. Okay, then we can, if there are no more questions, but I think it was a great talk. Thanks a lot, Francesca. Then we can move to our invited speaker, Professor Terry Chapman. It's an honor to have you with us. I think that Nicoletta will introduce you. Nicoletta?
Yes, thank you. I share the screen. Okay. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce you Professor Terry Chapman. He is a world-leading ecologist, and he truly produced so many important papers and provided so many important ideas for all the ecologists that truly, I don't know how to describe his work. He provided really a great contribution. And you can see here his PhD in Stanford University. He worked there for many years at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. Now he is Professor Emeritus. He is member of the National Academy of Sciences. He has been president of the Ecological Society of America. And he is one of the world leader of the Planetary Stewardship Initiative that he is carrying on at different levels, the international, the national, and the local level. He awarded several prizes and truly he now is working in Alaska, his actual activities, because he wants to improve the stewardship of the communities and the ability of the communities to live in a sustainable way. So promoting the health not only of ecosystems, but the sustainability of the social and the environmental components, so the human and the natural components. So I don't want to take out time from the presentation of Professor Chapman. And Terry, please take your time and have your speech. Thank you so much for being awake also so early, because in Alaska now it's 6 in the morning. So Professor Chapman has been very, very kind to wake up very early to participate with us. Thank you so much. We don't hear you, Terry.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. That's great. Thank you so much.
Can you see the slides that I'm presenting?
Yes, if you can go. Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's get started then. Buongiorno. I congratulate all of you for starting this wonderful program in sustainable development. It's one of the most important issues facing our planet today, both for nature and for society. And so it's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you about it. And I'd like to talk about it in some very broad terms. Over the course of human evolution, climate has changed drastically, as you can see in this slide. And on the right, you can see that over the last 10,000 years, the climate has not only become warmer, but it's also become incredibly stable. And it's only during this period of climatic stability that people have developed the features that we think of as characterizing the human species. It's at this time that agriculture began, and that the great civilizations began to develop. But even in this period of temperature stability, there has continued to be temperature fluctuations, as we know. And the most radical of these is the change in climate that's occurred in the last 150 years. Climate is warming, and we are moving outside of this zone of temperature stability that has nourished civilizations and societies during historical times. This is an unprecedented experiment in the time of human evolution. So it's something that we should take very seriously. So I'd like to think about it in some broad terms, and this is the general framework that I'd like you to consider as a foundation for sustainable development. That there are human drivers of the changes that are occurring, such as changes in climate. And these are primarily changes in global population, which has increased exponentially through history, and changes in our use of resources, such as water, timber, and other resources. Together, the population and our use of resources has altered the environment, and it has altered the cover of our planet through land conversion. These changes in environment and ecosystems have many ecosystem consequences, These include such as the identity and number of species as a result of very high rates of species extinction, and the exploitation of species that we use for food, such as marine fisheries. Now, these changes in ecosystems have consequences for society. We can talk about these in terms of ecosystem services. They are the benefits that society receives from ecosystems. And you can see that most of the ecosystem services that have been studied are decreasing. Only a few of ecosystem services are increasing, and these are those which we manipulate most directly, such as agriculture and aquaculture. Now, we know that these changes in ecosystem services are going to affect what decisions society makes, and therefore has the potential to influence both positively or negatively the changes in human population and our use of resources. So the challenge to sustainable development is to think about this entire cycle of amplifying feedbacks of changes to our planet and think of ways that we can reduce the impacts of society on this cycle of change. And this brings me to stewardship, which is a framework that I'd like to talk about. This is the active shaping of pathways of human nature interactions to enhance ecosystem health and human well-being. So the key aspects of this framework are active intervention to shape changes rather than passive responses or reactive responses to respond to changes that have occurred. It's thinking about people as part of nature rather than something that's above or separate from nature. And it's recognizing that sustainable development requires two primary goals. One is the health of ecosystems on which society depends, and the other is human well-being, which is the well-being of society itself. Now, we already know a lot about the science of stewardship. And one of your challenges as becoming advocates of sustainable development is to improve the science of stewardship. And this can take many different forms. It can improve our understanding of how it is that we sustain ecosystem properties. We know in a general sense that if the soils are degraded, if climate changes radically, if organisms in their diversity change, or if disturbance regime changes, then these will change the properties of ecosystems and the way in which ecosystems affect society. We know that we need to sustain benefits to society from ecosystem services. And I'll return to this in a moment. And finally, we know that we need to sustain human well-being directly, sustain society's long-term potential to thrive. So first, let's think about ecosystem services, which are the central part of this diagram. Our goal here as advocates of sustainable development is to link ecosystem processes and human well-being in such a way that both nature and society can thrive. So let's begin with human well-being. The decisions that we make as a result of the things that we're capable of doing and have the resources to do influence the decisions on the ways in which we exploit ecosystems, impact ecosystems, or steward ecosystems so as to restore them and to sustain their properties, things such as the maintenance of biodiversity. Ecosystem processes, in turn, influences the benefit that we receive from nature. They influence the things that we harvest from nature, such as food, water, and fiber. It influences the ways in which ecosystems the ways in which ecosystems influence the interactions among ecosystems and the interactions between nature and society. We know that climate change influences people globally. We know that changes in flood regimes and fire regimes have tremendous impacts on human well-being. And we know that these changes in ecosystem services trace back to the properties of ecosystems. And finally, cultural services are important. These are the the source of our identity as cultures. They're the source of the aesthetics that make our lives both pleasant and tolerable. They give us our sense of place and our sense of values. So all of these ecosystem services influence the well-being of society, and through interaction with social processes influence the balance between ecosystem exploitation and stewardship. Now let's think about the social dimensions of human well-being and of stewardship. Now, I think it's really important as scholars of sustainable development that you think carefully about social processes as well as about ecological processes, because these social processes are important, and in many cases are the factors that actually influence most strongly the way in which the planet is changing. Now, psychologists know that if we look at the things that all people depend on, certain aspects of human well-being shown on the right here, all people depend on food and water, safety, security and health, love and belonging, self-esteem, and capacity to meet our personal goals. These depend on processes such as sustaining environmental and material conditions, sustaining good social relationships among nations and among sectors of society, and empowering people to be able to meet their own goals and needs. These, in turn, depend over multiple generations, and we have to think carefully about how to sustain these processes over multiple generations. How do we sustain technology and economy and bring these to nations that do not yet have these opportunities? This has long been a central tenet of sustainable development. How do we sustain the environment and health? Another long-term tenet of sustainable development. But others that are equally or more important are sustaining the social rules that weave together the fabric of societies and make them function effectively. How do we promote the values across generations that enable societies to sustain their cultures and to sustain a good life? And how do we educate people in a way that they can sustain the capacities that are needed for sustainable development? These are big challenges for sustainable development. And I don't want you to lose these large scale issues as you think about the details of sustainable development. Now, I've written about these in a book about grassroots stewardship. And the challenges for sustainable development are really clear. World problems are serious, and the future of humanity is at stake. We need to take action now. We can't wait for a decade until people figure things out. And particularly importantly, governments need to take action, but they won't take action unless society is willing to support the action. So we need to convince society that these issues are important. So education and promotion of societal goals that support stewardship is really important. Now, another thing I think it's important to realize that even though the future of the state of the planet is deteriorating, the solutions are feasible. So how do we persuade people and governments that this is an important set of issues, but that they can make a difference? And that's the challenge that you need to undertake as advocates of sustainable development. There's 4 levels of stewardship action that I think about. Actions that can be taken by individuals, the challenge of communicating goals across society, collaborating among sectors of society and among nations, and taking political action for sustainability. So I want to say a little bit about each of these. First, with respect to individual actions, a lot of the things that we can do are downright pleasant and fun. And we should think about all aspects of sustainable development as ways in which, as positive opportunities rather than things we have to suffer with. So celebrating connections with nature is really important. Recognizing our sense of place and our identity and the way these link to nature. Connecting kids and our friends with nature by taking them out into nature, taking them to parks, encouraging them to take hikes, fostering people's interactions with nature rather than simply looking for ways to protect nature from people, and finding ways to build and sustain these values of appreciating nature across generation. Now, of course, the other important, and let me just tell you a personal story about how this has happened in my family. My great-grandfather was a third-generation inhabitant of New York City. He was totally immersed in New York City. But once a year, he took his family on vacation, and they spent time fishing and hiking and painting. And in turn, my grandfather took his children camping and fishing, and my parents have taken me and my brother and sister into nature. And as a resident of Alaska, our children have grown up in nature, and now my son takes his children out in nature, and that's what they most enjoy doing, even though they live in a city. So you can see that in my family, across 6 generations spanning 100 years, this valuing of nature is something that is passed very easily from one generation to another. So we need to find ways in which it's easier for society to appreciate nature and encourage people to do that. This is just something that's very pleasant to do, and something that's, we need to look for opportunities to do this across nations, across sectors of society. The other aspect of reducing our impact on nature is reducing unnecessary consumption by reducing population growth and reducing per capita consumption. Now, we need to frame this conversation as opportunities rather than suffering. So, for example, in developing nations, the thing that's proved to be most successful in reducing population growth is general education for girls, not pursuing some particular agenda, but just providing opportunities for education. This is something that development agencies can do. And also, in all nations, reducing unwanted pregnancies. Now, different religions and sectors of society have different ways in which they might seek to do it. But I think most of us would agree that unwanted pregnancies are something to avoid through various means. Now, let me turn to reducing per capita consumption. And this is most important to consider in developed nations and in those sectors of society that are relatively well off. Now, this is a map of the countries of the world where each country is represented by its size and its use of resources, its ecological footprint, the resources it consumes relative to those resources regenerated. And you can see that developed nations such as the United States, Europe, and Japan are bloated relative to other countries. That's because the average citizen in these countries uses 32 times more resources than the average citizen in a developing nation. So the place where we can have the most impact is influencing the behavior and attitudes of people in developed nations. That's where we live. That's where our friends and neighbors and families live. So we're in an unusually good position to influence the future of the planet. And we can do this by pursuing non-consumptive dimensions of satisfaction and happiness. Time spent with families, providing opportunities for our children, education, the quality of education, and reducing unnecessary consumption. Not reducing consumption by everybody, but by those of us who are consuming more than our share. And I think we can do this both through our own activities and through changing the incentives that society faces as they make their decisions about what to consume and how much to consume. Everybody notices what their neighbors are doing, and many of the things that we do are highly visible to others. And so if we can promote those norms that reduce unnecessary consumption, things such as the transportation pathways that we use, the recycling that we either engage in or don't engage in, and the levels of conspicuous consumption that we engage in. All of these influence all of the people around us because they see what they're doing and they influence other people. So that's an opportunity to influence society generally. Now, it also is important to be informed about what matters most. The things that you see on the right here are those aspects that are usually emphasized in reducing our impact on the planet. Of the activities that are shown here on the left are other things that influence our impact on the planet and which have an impact on climate. Having one less child, having no car, taking one less transatlantic flight, using renewable energy, switching to a plant-based diet. Now, all of these are things where they're not black and white issues. We can choose to have one less child. It's not to say that nobody should have children or that they should only have one child or no children. It's just if we're considering how many children to have, considering having one less child or considering taking one less transatlantic flight or eating a plant-based diet on some days during the year. There are actions that we can take that reduce our impact on the planet. Now, communication is important for all of us, and especially for you who will be advocates for sustainable development. You need to communicate effectively. And so this means identifying points of agreement, finding the common ground on which you can identify with your audience. And we need to be able to communicate with various sectors of society, with managers, with religious groups. So producing knowledge in collaboration with practitioners and looking for ways to communicate that will span political divides. Now, effective communication depends on building trust with your audience, emphasizing the positive messages that are focused on solutions rather than blaming people for the behavior they've undertaken, and finding ways to diffuse contentious conversations by listening respectfully and by finding messengers who a particular audience trusts. In many cases, we may not be the individuals that will be most effective in reaching those audiences. So we need to find people that we can have respectful conversation with that can in turn carry that message to their audiences. Now, collaboration is something that's really important in sustainable development. And one of the things that surprised me to learn is that the thing that's most important in effective collaboration is not that we agree about things, but that we share the same problems and that the groups are dependent on one another to solve these problems. It doesn't matter whether we're in conflict or whether we're prone to collaboration, although of course it's easier if we're prone to collaboration. But if one group has the power to solve problems, they've got the incentives to do it on their own and to force others in society to take into that solution. But if we're interdependent on solving problems, as we are for so many of the global problems today, then we need to find ways to come together in dialogue, to build trust, to commit to a particular set of processes. And maybe we come to only intermediate outcomes in the beginning. Perhaps we only learn to sit down together without shouting at each other. But eventually, by developing this collaborative process, we can improve outcomes. And this is something we need to understand and engage in as advocates of sustainable development. Now, political action is obviously important, both through our responsibilities as citizens, such as actively informing ourselves, voting and participating in government and in institutions, but also by challenging inequities. We're at a time of accelerating inequality so that the most vulnerable people, the people that are most vulnerable to climate change and to the deterioration of our planet, are the ones that suffer most. Now, so it's important to address inequalities as we're seeking to support sustainable development. Now, one of the things that encourages me is that I think we're probably close to a social tipping point. If we look at the opinions of people in industrialized society, 58% of people are concerned about the state of the planet. Most people believe that the planet is close to a tipping point because of human actions. And one of the things that surprised me is that most people believe the government should prioritize well-being of both people and nature rather than prioritizing jobs over nature. So we can do this. So in summary, we inhabit a planet that's in transition, unfortunately, in a negative direction, but its pathway is ours to choose. And as advocates of sustainability, sustainable development, we are going to have a huge impact on this pathway. The future of today's youth is at risk. It's not the future of future generations that we need to worry about. It's our children and the younger members of today's society. We need to refocus societal's intent towards stewardship based on care for others and for nature through individual actions, effective communication, collaboration, and political action. And the things that's most encouraging to me is that these individual steps are feasible. The biggest challenge for sustainable development, I think, is to integrate these steps and scale them up so that they really matter at a planetary scale. But this often means beginning at home. Thank you for your attention, and good luck to you in fostering these pathways of sustainable development.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you for this interesting bridge between nature and human and the well-being of both. That is in the interest of everybody, I would say. But Dennis, if you have some comments.
Actually, this was a very interesting speech. Thank you very much, Professor Chapin. Indeed, you pointed on, you touched upon a number of issues that bring together, planetary stewardship and also social stewardship. So overall sustainability, if you like. So that I think this really bridged very nicely the different, threads of this particular part of the social development, sustainable development and climate change PhD program. Maybe the students and the colleagues have some questions for you, and then we can bring this to a closure. I can wrap it up. So if you have any questions to Professor Chapin.
I see something in the chat.
Yes, there is something in the chat about, I see one question on overpopulation or mismanagement of resources. Which one of the drivers could be, if I understand the question?
There is also a student with a hand.
Ah, okay. I don't see the student with the hand. Ah, okay. Tosin, please.
Unmute. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Terry Chapman, for the wonderful presentation. You talked about sustainability, which is very pivotal to this generation. When it comes to sustainable cities, sustainable societies, I want to ask this question. How do we create a balance? How do we create a balance between developing nations and developed nations? For instance, when you are presenting, you also talk about it, that in the developed nations, they tend to use more resources, and which is going to lead to more production. As well, in the developing nations as well, they want to improve on their living standard, or they want to build standard and beautiful cities, and that is also going to affect sustainable production and consumption. So the thing is now in the developed nations, now they will come to say to the developing nations, oh, reduce your production, and all the rest like that, so that, they won't be able to, improve on the standard of living or build more cities. While in the developed nations, they use more resources. So how do we come to a state of balance between developing nations and developed nations in the context of sustainability? One want to improve on their standard of living in the cities, while one is using more resources. So how do we do this in this context so that we can be able to achieve the real sustainability in the whole world?
That's a wonderful question, and it's such an important question. First of all, I think it's important that developed nations focus very strongly on reducing their own consumption. But this, of course, has impacts on developing nations, because these developing nations have been the sources of so many of the materials that are used elsewhere. So I think developed nations have a responsibility to develop green jobs that can replace the jobs that developing nations depend on from extractive industries, so that as extractive industries decline, other jobs and other sources of employment can be increased, so that developing nations can improve their economies, so that their cities can thrive. So I think developed nations need to step up to their responsibility, to recognize their global responsibilities, so that those people who do not have adequate resources for a good life are able to have good jobs, are able to raise their families in good conditions, and are able to develop in ways that don't mimic the worst aspects of the pathways of developed nations, but follow the responsible pathways that developed nations and everybody on the planet needs to follow. Now, I think there's some encouraging opportunities. One is that the rate of human population growth for the planet as a whole is beginning to is no longer accelerating as rapidly as it was, and this is a positive trend, because that in itself will reduce the global demand for resources. But I think the larger challenge is to reduce inequity between nations, between developed and developing nations, and between sectors of society within both developed and developing nations. Thank you for raising that important question.
There is another question for Professor Chapman. Mauro?
Yes, thank you, Terry, for your inspiring presentation. In one of the diagrams that you show, there is a point that I think it is very important, but also very crucial in terms of policy. The question of the population, because you indicated that one less child is the maximum that individually or as a family we can do to reduce the problem of the development of the resources. So, but this is much more difficult to respect. Take one intercontinental flight, so less. So in other words, I can imagine that for the policymakers, it's really difficult to convince to do less children, especially in the developed countries.
Well, here I think it's useful to recognize that having a child in a developed nation has much greater environmental impact than having one more child in a developing nation. So it's here at home in our own countries where we can have the biggest impact through our decisions about family size in future resource consumption. And so I think it's important for each of us as individual families to make these decisions carefully. It's important to reduce human population growth in the planet, because the planet has more people than it can support sustainably. And it's also important to recognize people's rights to make their own personal decisions in a responsible way. That's why I think I would feel very uncomfortable in policies that might seek to specify the number of children that a family can have. I feel much more comfortable with helping people recognize that the decisions they make about their family size not only influences their own family and the happiness of their own family, but also influences the planet as a whole, and especially their own community and their own country.
Thank you.
And with respect to international flights, I think the scientific community and the sustainable development community in general we've been quite guilty about making more transatlantic flights, more long-term flights than most members of society. So here again, we're in a good position to make a big difference by reducing the number of flights we take. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you by Zoom rather than traveling there. Although I dearly love Italy and I would love to be there, I must confess.
Very good point, Professor Chapman. A very good point. Okay.
Thank you again. And we will try to organize some other occasions to meet by Zoom or personally, because in a short time, Terry, will from the Insubria University, a group of researchers will come to Alaska because we are opening the international branch campus in Barrow. So in any case, we will have to take one transatlantic flight, but we will try to reduce as much as possible the pollution and the consumption as well. Thank you so much again, especially for the early wake up that we asked you today. Thank you again, and for your important contribution, because I think that the problem of our education to be sensible to these topics, which are not only science, but is our interaction with the society, the planning of our life, the education of our families, is something that is going beyond only science or research, but is much more important because it could be a way to try to solve the problem. The problem is huge, but we can try to solve it. Thank you again.
We can certainly make the situation better. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and I am so proud of your educational program in sustainable development. That's exactly the sort of topic that needs to be pursued more actively, and I congratulate you for doing this.
Grazie, thank you.
So much. Okay, so we bring this to a wrap. I think we are on time. Again, well, we didn't have enough time to have a long discussion, but I think we did get an overview of this very exciting curriculum, that is curriculum 6, which tries to bring together the aspects regarding sustainability and climate change impacts, both on the ecosystem and on human health. And as you saw, there's a very good and a very important interplay between the two, which we have identified, and hopefully you will identify even further through your research work, not only within the people in CU6, in curriculum 6, but also with other curricula, because I know that, as you saw, there's a number of actions and research aspects that you guys touch upon in your own research, which of course have an influence on what is being done in this particular case on ecosystems and health and human health. Do you have any important question that is still pending? Okay, if not, then I usually like to close this kind of large meetings with a question that is what we all think that actually went well today. But I'd like to, and you know, what gave you, you know, in a positive manner. I think that as I cherish the words of Professor Chapman of trying to keep the positive side of things, because that is what brings about change. And I think this is what we need to do in our PhD program. So one view, what was the most positive thing you actually brought home, if I can put it like that, from today? One answer. You gain a free dinner in Pavia once you're in Pavia, of course, at the physical meeting. Anybody?
Maybe something positive that we learned today is that there is some room for action. So, of course, the climate emergency is a big emergency, but there is still some room of action for individual actions to make some changes. So probably this is one of the best takeaway from today.
Perfect, Juliana. You are a winner of the dinner. That's great. This is registered, so this is recorded, so you have proof on that. And Mario confirmed, so that's fine. Okay, well then, with that, if you don't want to add on upon Juliana's comment, then I'd like to bid you farewell until I guess tomorrow.
Dennis, let me say two things.
Yes,
first of all, thank to all the speakers, and especially to Terry. Thank you very much for participating in this way, for contributing in this way to our PhD program. I have just two small information for the students. First, you will receive the link for the learning test a little bit later than usually. We'll give you at least half an hour of rest before the learning test, so I'll send you the learning test in a little bit of time. And second, I'd like to project for a second the program for tomorrow, because there is a slight change of the timetable. Usually we do two slots, two sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and that's also for tomorrow, but the time is a little bit different. Tomorrow, Elisa Giuliani will introduce the sessions at 11, and there will be one presentation until 12:35. Then there will be a break of 2 hours, and we'll start earlier. We'll start at 2:30 in the afternoon. We'll finish at 5 as usually, but we'll do a little bit longer afternoon session tomorrow. Here you see the topic. I invite you to go on the link for the program, because we updated the program, and there was a change of one presentation. So you will find there the updated program, the short bios, the references, and everything that you need to be prepared for the presentations tomorrow. I will update also the table with the links to the recording today. You know, I need that Zoom actually elaborate at the end of each session the recording. That's why I cannot update it soon after the end of the seminar. It requires approximately an hour. So this evening you will find the links to recordings, and we will also upload in the folders not just the presentations, but also the file with the questions that you wrote in the chat and the answers. Okay, that folder could be available to you for the next months, also as a reference for this webinar. So I thank you very much. I thank again Denis, Marina, Nicoletta, all the speakers today provide the presentations, and especially our guest, Terry Chapman. And we'll meet tomorrow at 11. Take a rest this evening, and we'll see tomorrow. Thank you to everyone. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.